The crystal chandelier cast harsh shadows across the mahogany dining table as Charles Morrison's voice cut through the refined chatter of Charleston's elite. "Maria, where's my scotch?" His words carried the particular venom reserved for those he considered beneath him. I stood frozen in the doorway of the Morrison Mansion's grand dining room, silver tray trembling in my hands. 24 guests, oil executives, real estate moguls, city councilmen, all turned to witness what they knew was coming. Charles Morrison never missed an opportunity to remind everyone of their place in his carefully constructed hierarchy. "Sir, I brought the Macallan as requested," I began, but Charles's hand slammed against the table, making the fine china jump. "Don't 'sir' me with that accent," he snarled, his weathered face flushing red beneath his perfectly styled silver hair. "And why are your hands shaking? Are you nervous around important people?" The laughter that followed wasn't genuine. It was the uncomfortable sound wealthy people make when they witness cruelty but lack the courage to intervene. I'd heard it countless times during my 2 years working for the Morrison family. Charles Morrison built his empire the way he built everything else, on the backs of people who couldn't fight back. Morrison luxury hotels stretched from Atlanta to Miami, each property a monument to Southern hospitality that existed only in the marketing brochures. Behind the scenes, housekeepers worked 16-hour shifts. Kitchen staff received paychecks with mysterious deductions, and anyone who complained simply disappeared from the payroll. "Maria here is from Guatemala," Charles announced to his guests, as if I weren't standing 3 feet away. "Came here with nothing. We've been generous enough to provide her with honest work." His emphasis on generous drew knowing chuckles from his audience. I kept my eyes down, but my mind was sharp and recording every word. Charles Morrison saw what he wanted to see, a scared immigrant woman who needed his charity to survive. He never noticed how carefully I observed his patterns, how I memorized his schedules, how I positioned myself to overhear his private conversations. "Tell them how grateful you are, Maria," Charles continued, his pale blue eyes gleaming with malicious pleasure. "Tell them how the Morrison family has changed your life. I'm very grateful for the opportunity, Mr. Morrison." The words tasted like ash, but they were necessary. Every humiliation, every cruel remark, every moment of manufactured powerlessness was being catalogued for a purpose Charles couldn't imagine. "You see?" Charles spread his arms wide, playing to his audience. "This is what America is about. Giving people chances they'd never have in their own countries." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Of course, some people need more guidance than others." Mayor Richardson nodded approvingly. "Your family has always understood the importance of maintaining proper standards, Charles." As I poured the scotch with steady hands, steadier than they'd been moments ago, I thought about the small digital recorder hidden in my apron pocket. Tonight's performance would join dozens of others in my growing collection of evidence. Charles Morrison's arrogance was his weakness. He performed his cruelty publicly because he believed himself untouchable. "Maria," Charles called as I turned to leave, "make sure you clean this mess properly. These glasses cost more than you make in a month." There was no mess. There never was. But I nodded silently and retreated to the kitchen, where I would transcribe tonight's conversation into my notebook, the same notebook that contained detailed records of wage theft, documentation of unsafe working conditions, and testimonies from other employees too frightened to speak. Outside the kitchen window, Charleston's historic district glowed golden in the evening light. Tourists strolled past with cameras, capturing the romantic facade of the Old South. They couldn't see what happened in the shadows of these grand homes, couldn't hear the voices of those whose labor maintained the beautiful illusion. Charles Morrison had built his fortune on silence and fear. What he didn't understand was that silence, when carefully preserved and strategically broken, could become the most powerful weapon of all. As laughter echoed from the dining room, I reached for my notebook and began to write. Justice, I had learned, required patience, planning, and perfect documentation. Tonight was just another entry in what would soon become Charles Morrison's downfall. Robert Morrison had always been the family disappointment, and he wore that title like armor against his father's expectations. While Charles built his empire on exploitation, Robert spent his trust fund fighting for the exploited through the Charleston Workers' Rights Coalition. The irony wasn't lost on me as I dusted the framed photographs in Charles's study, images of Robert's Harvard graduation, his brief stint at Morrison Hotels, and the newspaper clipping from when he'd quit to join what Charles called those bleeding heart troublemakers. Robert's rebellion had started early and never wavered. Maria. The voice behind me was gentle, nothing like his father's commanding bark. I turned to find Robert in the doorway, his dark hair disheveled from the humid Charleston morning, wearing jeans and a wrinkled button-down that would have horrified Charles. "Mr. Robert," I said softly, glancing toward the hallway. Charles was at the downtown hotel, but his presence seemed to linger in every corner of this house. "Just Robert, please." He stepped into the room, and I noticed something different in his expression, a determination I'd never seen before. "I heard what happened at dinner last night." My hands stilled on the silver frame I'd been polishing. "I don't understand. The humiliation. The performance for his friends." Robert's jaw tightened. It wasn't the first time, was it? I set down the frame carefully, buying time to think. Robert had always treated the staff with respect, but Charles's son asking direct questions felt dangerous. "Your father. He has high standards. My father is a cruel man who gets pleasure from hurting people who can't fight back." The words hung in the air between us like a confession, and I'm tired of watching it happen. Before I could respond, Robert dropped to one knee in the middle of his father's study. "Marry me, Maria." The cleaning supplies slipped from my hands, clattering across the hardwood floor. "What?" I know it sounds crazy, but hear me out. Robert's eyes were intense, desperate. "My father can't touch you if you're family. The Morrison name comes with protection. Legal protection, social protection, financial protection. You'd be safe. Robert, you don't—" I started, but he interrupted. "I know you're documenting everything. I've seen you writing in that notebook, seen how carefully you position yourself during his meetings. You're building a case against him, aren't you?" My blood ran cold. If Robert knew, who else might have noticed? "The marriage would give you credibility," he continued. "When you're ready to go public, you won't just be the help making accusations. You'll be family. You'll have standing." I stared at this man, this privileged white man who could have chosen any life, any woman, any path, kneeling in his father's study and offering to sacrifice his future for mine. "Your father will destroy you," I whispered. "He's already trying." Robert's laugh was bitter. "Do you know what he said when I quit Morrison Hotels? That I was a disappointment who'd never amount to anything. That I was weak for caring about other people's problems." He paused. "Marrying you, protecting you, it's the strongest thing I could do." Through the study's tall windows, I could see the Charleston harbor where slave ships had once docked, where fortunes were built on human suffering that polite society preferred to forget. The Morrison fortune had different origins but similar foundations, wealth extracted from the vulnerable. "The press will go crazy," I said, testing his resolve. "Good, the more attention, the better. When you're ready to reveal what you know about him, the whole world will be watching." I thought about my hidden recordings, my documented evidence, my carefully cultivated connections with lawyers who specialized in workers' rights. I thought about the other women who'd worked for Charles, the ones who'd been quietly fired, threatened, or simply disappeared when they became inconvenient. "This isn't just about me," I said finally. "There are others." "I know," Robert's voice was steady. "And together we can help them find their voices too." The proposal wasn't romantic in any traditional sense. It was strategic, revolutionary, and incredibly risky. But as I looked into Robert's determined face, I realized he understood something his father never would, that true power came from lifting people up, not tearing them down. "The wedding would have to be public," I said slowly. "Very public. The bigger the better. Every society reporter in Charleston, every news outlet in South Carolina. When the Morrison heir marries the immigrant housemaid, it becomes a story that can't be ignored." I picked up my cleaning supplies with hands that were no longer shaking. For 2 years, I'd been preparing for a war against Charles Morrison. I just found my most powerful ally. Yes, I said simply. Robert's smile transformed his entire face. We'll announce it tonight at the charity gala. Maximum impact. As he left the study, I remained among the symbols of Charles Morrison's power, his awards, his photographs, his carefully curated image of respectability. Soon, this room would be just another piece of evidence in the case against him. Tonight, the real battle would begin. That evening, after Robert's announcement sent shockwaves through Charleston's elite social circle, I sat in my small apartment above the Morrison carriage house, surrounded by 2 years of carefully collected evidence. The shoebox under my bed contained more than Charles Morrison could ever imagine. Digital recorder number 1 held 47 conversations where Charles discussed wage theft with his hotel managers. These people don't understand money anyway. His voice crackled through the tiny speakers. A few missing hours here and there. What's the difference to them? File folder number 1 contained photocopied payroll records I'd obtained during my cleaning duties. Charles systematically shorted immigrant workers' overtime, knowing they were too afraid of deportation to complain. The math was simple and devastating. Over $50,000 stolen annually from housekeeping staff alone. But the crown jewel of my collection was the leather journal I kept locked in my bedroom dresser. Every incident, every cruel comment, every illegal action was documented with dates, times, and witnesses. My handwriting filled 300 pages of methodical evidence gathering. I hadn't planned this level of documentation when I first started working for the Morrisons. Initially, I'd simply wanted to survive long enough to send money home to my sister in Guatemala City. But Charles's cruelty was so systematic, so calculated, that patterns began emerging I couldn't ignore. The first recording happened by accident. I'd left my phone in the kitchen during one of Charles's staff meetings, and it captured him threatening to call immigration on anyone who complained about working conditions. When I listened back later, I realized I'd stumbled onto something powerful. That's when I reached out to Sarah Martinez at the Charleston Workers' Rights Coalition, Robert's organization, though I didn't know the connection then. Sarah introduced me to Jennifer Walsh, a lawyer who specialized in labor violations and immigrant rights. Document everything, Jennifer had advised during our first secret meeting at a coffee shop in North Charleston. Dates, times, witnesses, financial records if you can get them. Cases like this live or die on documentation, so I became a detective in my own life. I learned Charles' schedule better than his own secretary did. I knew when he'd be drinking heavily and likely to say incriminating things. I positioned myself strategically during important phone calls and meetings. The digital files on my ancient laptop told the story of a systematic criminal operation disguised as legitimate business. Charles Morrison wasn't just cruel. He was running an organized scheme to exploit vulnerable workers across his entire hotel chain. But tonight, everything changed. Robert's proposal wasn't just about protection. It was about platform. When Jennifer Walsh learned that I was marrying into the Morrison family, her excitement was barely contained. "This changes the entire case," she'd said during our emergency phone call after the charity gala announcement. "You'll have legal standing, social credibility, and media attention. When we go public, it won't be David versus Goliath. It'll be a family civil war with documented evidence." My phone buzzed with a text from Robert. "Can we meet? Need to see what we're working with." An hour later, he sat in my tiny living room staring at the evidence spread across my coffee table. His face grew paler with each recording, each photograph, each detailed journal entry. Jesus Maria. This is federal criminal stuff. Wire fraud, labor trafficking, tax evasion. He picked up a transcribed conversation about bribing building inspectors. "How long have you been building this case?" 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days, I said. The precision wasn't accidental. Every day working for his father had been calculated toward this moment. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" I gestured around my sparse apartment, secondhand furniture, a hot plate instead of a stove, bars on the windows. Who would believe me? I'm an undocumented immigrant housemaid accusing one of Charleston's most powerful men. Even with evidence, I'd be dismissed as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge." Robert nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "But now I'm family. Now I have the Morrison name and all the protection that comes with it. Now when I speak, people will listen." He leaned back against my worn couch, running his hands through his hair. "This is bigger than just you, isn't it? There are other victims, dozens. Kitchen staff, housekeepers, maintenance workers across all the hotels. Jennifer has been quietly documenting cases for months, waiting for the right moment to coordinate legal action. The marriage announcement. It's not just protection. It's the signal. Exactly. Tomorrow, Jennifer files the first lawsuit on behalf of 3 former employees. Next week, 2 more. By the end of the month, Charles Morrison will be facing a coordinated legal assault from multiple victims, all with documented evidence, all with credible representation." Robert stared at the evidence again, and I saw something shift in his expression. This wasn't just about saving me anymore. This was about justice for everyone his father had harmed. "What do you need from me?" he asked quietly. "Exactly what you've already given me. Your name, your protection, and your platform. When this story breaks nationally, and it will, I need to be seen as a credible witness, not a vengeful employee." Outside my window, Charleston's church bells chimed midnight. In 12 hours, our engagement announcement would be in every newspaper in South Carolina. In 24 hours, the first lawsuit would be filed. Charles Morrison's empire was built on silence and fear. Tomorrow, that silence would begin to shatter. Charles Morrison's rage was a living thing that morning, filling his downtown office like toxic smoke. The Charleston Post and Courier lay spread across his mahogany desk, the engagement announcement photo staring back at him, his son and my smiling faces beneath the headline, "Morrison heir to marry family employee." "Get her in here, now." His voice was ice when he called the house, but I could hear the fury burning underneath. Within an hour, I stood in his corner office overlooking Charleston Harbor, the same harbor where his ancestors had built their first fortune on human cargo. "Sit." Charles didn't look up from the newspaper. His silver hair was perfectly styled as always, but his hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. "Explain this circus to me." I kept my expression neutral, channeling 2 years of practice at hiding my thoughts. Robert proposed. I accepted. "Don't play naive with me." Charles's pale eyes finally met mine, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Fear. This isn't some fairy tale romance. You're a housemaid from Guatemala. My son doesn't make impulsive decisions about anything, especially not marriage. The first offer came an hour later. $500,000 in cash, a green card, and safe passage to anywhere in the United States. All I had to do was disappear before the wedding and never contact Robert again. "Think about it," Charles said, sliding the cashier's check across his desk. $500,000. More money than your entire family will see in 10 lifetimes. You could buy a house, start a business, bring your relatives to America legally. I stared at the check, letting him think I was tempted. "That's very generous, Mr. Morrison. It's practical. This marriage would be a disaster for everyone involved. You, Robert, our family, our business. The media attention alone would be catastrophic." When I didn't immediately accept, Charles's demeanor shifted. The fake benevolence disappeared, replaced by the calculating predator I knew so well. "Of course, if you prefer the alternative." He opened a file folder, revealing photographs of me taken without my knowledge, entering my apartment, meeting with Jennifer Walsh, shopping at the North Charleston markets where undocumented workers gathered. Immigration raids are so common these days, especially when someone calls in tips about illegal workers. The threat was clear, but Charles had made a crucial miscalculation. 2 years of documentation had taught me to think several moves ahead. "I understand your concerns," I said carefully. "Perhaps we should discuss this with Robert present. My son is being manipulated by someone who clearly knows how to exploit his idealistic tendencies." Charles leaned back in his leather chair, studying me like a specimen. "But I've dealt with gold diggers before, Maria. They always have a price." That afternoon, Charles called Robert to his office. I waited in the outer reception area, listening through the partially open door as father tried to turn son against the woman he'd proposed to protect. "She's using you, Robert. Can't you see that? This girl has been planning this from the moment she set foot in our house." "Planning what, exactly? To fall in love?" Robert's voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. "To trap you in a scandal that will destroy everything our family has built. The Morrison name, our business reputation, your political future, gone. All because you let some immigrant housemaid convince you she needed saving. Maybe she does need saving. From you." The silence that followed was thick with decades of unresolved conflict between father and son. When Charles spoke again, his voice was dangerously quiet. "If you go through with this farce, you're no longer my son. No trust fund, no inheritance, no family connections. You'll be cut off completely." "Good," Robert replied. "I never wanted your dirty money anyway." By evening, Charles had escalated to hiring private investigators. He wanted everything: my immigration status, my family history, my financial records, any previous employers, any criminal connections. If he couldn't buy me off or scare me away, he'd destroy my credibility before I could destroy his. What Charles didn't know was that Jennifer Walsh had anticipated this response. Every aspect of my background had been thoroughly reviewed and prepared for. My immigration attorney had already filed protective paperwork. My financial records were clean because I'd been careful to document every dollar earned and spent. The phone calls to local media outlets started that night. Charles Morrison had friends at the Charleston newspapers, the local TV stations, the radio programs. He tried to spin the engagement as a publicity stunt, a desperate attempt by his troubled son to embarrass the family business. But social media moved faster than traditional journalism. Robert's announcement at the charity gala had been captured on dozens of phones, shared across Facebook and Instagram by Charleston's young professional network. The narrative Charles wanted to control was already beyond his reach. Standing in my apartment that night, reading the text messages of support from people I'd never met, I realized Charles Morrison was learning a lesson his generation had never been forced to accept. Power, built on silence and intimidation, crumbled quickly. In the age of instant communication, his desperation was showing, and desperate men made mistakes. Tomorrow, the first lawsuit would be filed. Charles Morrison's empire was about to discover that some voices could no longer be silenced, no matter how much money or influence he possessed. The hunt was becoming the hunted, and he didn't even realize it yet. The first call came to Jennifer Walsh's office at 7:23 a.m., 3 hours after the Charleston Morning News featured my engagement story. Carmen Rodriguez, former housekeeper at Morrison Hotel Savannah, had seen my face on television and recognized something familiar in my expression. "I saw her eyes," Carmen told Jennifer during their phone conversation, which I listened to on speaker from Jennifer's downtown law office. "The same look I had when I worked for that monster. Like you're always watching, always documenting, always afraid, but too angry to quit." By noon, we had 3 former Morrison employees requesting meetings. By evening, that number had grown to 7. Each woman carried similar stories: wage theft, sexual harassment, impossible working conditions, and the constant threat of deportation. Hanging over their heads like a sword, Rosa Martinez had worked at Morrison Hotel, Charleston, for 18 months before Charles fired her for poor performance. Her real crime had been refusing his advances during a late-night inventory check in the hotel wine cellar. She'd kept the uniform they never asked her to return, along with the timesheets showing 16-hour shifts with no overtime pay. "He told me I should be grateful," Rosa said, sitting in Jennifer's conference room with hands folded tightly in her lap, "that women like me don't get opportunities like this in our own countries. That if I made trouble, he'd make sure I never worked in Charleston again." Patricia Vasquez had documented everything on her cell phone. Photos of the moldy staff quarters where housekeepers were forced to change clothes, recordings of managers discussing how to avoid paying workers' compensation claims, text messages from supervisors demanding she work through a broken wrist or face termination. I was saving evidence to send to my daughter in college, Patricia explained. I wanted her to understand why I stayed in such a terrible job. For her education, for her future. But I never thought anyone would listen to us. The most devastating testimony came from Isabel Santos, who'd worked at Morrison Hotel Columbia until last year. Charles had systematically stolen from the housekeeping staff's tip jars, claiming the money was needed for facility improvements that never materialized. When Isabel calculated the theft over her 3-year employment, the total exceeded $12,000. He made us sign papers saying tips were pooled and distributed monthly, Isabel said, producing a crumpled contract from her purse. But we never saw the money. When I asked about it, he said immigrants didn't understand American business practices. Jennifer spread the evidence across her conference table like a prosecutor preparing for the trial of the century. Pay stubs, photographs, recorded conversations, witness statements. Everything Charles Morrison had assumed would remain silent forever. This is textbook labor trafficking, Jennifer explained to our growing group of accusers, systematic exploitation of vulnerable workers through debt bondage, isolation, and coercion. It's federal criminal territory. But the most powerful moment came when Carmen Rodriguez looked directly at me and said, "Thank you for being brave enough to fight back. I thought I was the only one who saw what he really was." The support network formed organically. Rosa offered her apartment for meetings when the law office felt too formal. Patricia shared contact information for other women who'd worked at Morrison Properties but were too afraid to come forward. Isabel connected us with a reporter at the Columbia newspaper who'd been investigating labor violations in the hospitality industry. Within a week of my engagement announcement, Jennifer Walsh had enough evidence to file coordinated lawsuits against Charles Morrison and Morrison Hotels in 3 different jurisdictions. The charges ranged from wage theft and discrimination to sexual harassment and creating hostile work environments. The beauty of this approach, Jennifer explained during our final strategy meeting, is that each case strengthens the others. When judges see this pattern across multiple properties and years, it becomes impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents or disgruntled employees. The media strategy was equally coordinated. Robert's connections in Charleston's progressive political network helped us reach journalists who specialized in labor rights stories. Carmen's daughter, a communications major at USC, created social media campaigns that reached immigrant communities across the Southeast. Charles Morrison had built his empire on the assumption that his victims would remain isolated, ashamed, and silent. He never anticipated that one woman's courage could create a network of resistance that spanned state lines and language barriers. The night before the first lawsuit was filed, I sat in my apartment reading text messages from women I'd never met, housekeepers in Atlanta, kitchen staff in Miami, maintenance workers in Raleigh. Each message contained the same theme. "Thank you for speaking up. Your courage gave me courage." Charles Morrison had created his own downfall through decades of systematic cruelty. Every woman he'd abused, every worker he'd cheated, every threat he'd made in the shadows, all of it was about to emerge into the light simultaneously. Tomorrow morning, the avalanche would begin, and unlike his previous victims, we wouldn't be facing him alone. The hunter had become the hunted, and we were hunting in packs. The Morrison mansion buzzed with wedding preparations that felt more like battle preparations. Caterers moved through rooms where I'd once cleaned in silence. Florists arranged centerpieces on tables where Charles had humiliated me, and the same dining room that had witnessed my public degradation was being transformed into a celebration of resistance. Robert had insisted on holding the wedding at the family estate, despite, or perhaps because of, Charles's furious objections. "If we're making a statement," he'd said, "let's make it where it matters most." 3 days before the ceremony, Charleston's society pages were already calling it the wedding of the century. What they didn't know was that it would also mark the beginning of the legal avalanche that would bury Charles Morrison's empire. Jennifer. Walsh worked 18-hour days from a temporary command center she'd established in Robert's downtown apartment. The coordination required military precision, 7 lawsuits across 4 states, all timed to be filed simultaneously on Monday morning, the day after our wedding. The media will be primed, Jennifer explained during our final strategy meeting. Sunday's wedding coverage transitions directly into Monday's legal bombshell. Charles won't have time to control the narrative. The guest list had grown beyond Charleston's traditional social circles. Robert's colleagues from the Workers' Rights Coalition would be there, along with immigration lawyers, labor activists, and journalists from newspapers across the Southeast. Even Senator Williams from South Carolina planned to attend, drawn by what her staff called a significant labor rights development. Charles Morrison, predictably, was not handling the situation well. His private investigators had found nothing damaging in my background. Jennifer's careful preparation had seen to that. His attempts to pressure local media had backfired when social media amplified every story they tried to suppress. His threats of disinheritance only strengthened Robert's resolve. Thursday afternoon brought Charles's most desperate gambit yet. He arrived at the mansion unannounced, accompanied by Harrison and Associates, Charleston's most expensive legal firm, demanding to speak with me privately. "This is your last chance to avoid a catastrophe," Charles said, his usual polished demeanor cracking around the edges. "My lawyers have prepared dissolution papers. Sign them, take the money, and this nightmare ends for everyone." The check this time was for $2 million. I sat across from Charles in his own study, surrounded by the symbols of power he'd accumulated through decades of exploitation, and felt something I'd never experienced before: pity for him. "Mr. Morrison," I said quietly, "you still don't understand what's happening here." "I understand perfectly. You're a gold digger who's manipulated my son into a marriage that will embarrass this family for generations." "No, sir. I'm a woman who documented every crime you committed for 2 years. And on Monday morning, those documents become public record in 7 different lawsuits." The color drained from Charles' face. His lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Carmen Rodriguez's wage theft documentation from Savannah, Rosa Martinez's sexual harassment recordings from Charleston, Patricia Vasquez's photographs of unsafe working conditions in Colombia, Isabel Santos's proof of tip theft across 3 properties." I counted off each case on my fingers. Shall I continue? Charles Morrison had built his empire by terrorizing individual victims who felt powerless and alone. He'd never faced coordinated resistance from prepared, represented, strategically thinking opponents. "How much?" he asked finally. "Name your price. All of you. Whatever it takes." "There is no price, Mr. Morrison. This isn't about money anymore. It's about justice." That evening, Robert and I walked through downtown Charleston's historic district, past the antebellum mansions where tourists posed for photographs against the backdrop of romanticized oppression. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. We were about to be married in a house built by the Morrison family fortune, while simultaneously destroying that fortune's modern incarnation. "Are you sure about this?" Robert asked as we stood on the Battery, watching container ships navigate Charleston Harbor. "Once we go public Monday, there's no going back. For either of us." I thought about Carmen Rodriguez, working 16-hour shifts for a man who stole her wages. I thought about Rosa Martinez, fired for refusing sexual advances. I thought about Patricia Vasquez, documenting evidence on her phone while cleaning toilets with a broken wrist. "I've been sure for 2 years," I said. "The only thing I wasn't sure about was whether anyone would listen." "They'll listen now," Robert said quietly. "The whole country will listen." Sunday morning arrived gray and humid, typical Charleston weather that seemed to mirror the tension building around our wedding. By noon, the mansion's circular driveway was filled with news vans and photographers, society reporters mixing with labor journalists who sensed a bigger story developing. Inside the house, I put on the wedding dress Robert had insisted on buying. Simple, elegant, appropriate for a woman who was about to become the public face of workers' rights in America. In the mirror, I saw not just a bride, but a woman who'd transformed herself from victim to advocate through patience, planning, and perfect documentation. Tomorrow, Charles Morrison would wake up to find his world transformed. 7 lawsuits, national media attention, federal investigations, and the Morrison family name forever associated with labor exploitation rather than Southern hospitality. The wedding was just the beginning. Justice was the destination. The garden ceremony began at 4 o'clock under Charleston's ancient live oaks, their Spanish moss creating a natural cathedral that had witnessed 3 centuries of Southern history. Today, it would witness something unprecedented, the public marriage of privilege to justice. Robert stood at the altar his grandfather had used for his own wedding, but everything else about this ceremony defied Morrison family tradition. Instead of Charleston's usual society guests, the chairs were filled with labor lawyers, immigration advocates, and journalists whose presence signaled that this was more than a wedding. It was a declaration of war against systemic exploitation. Carmen Rodriguez sat in the front row, wearing her best dress and holding the hand of her daughter who'd driven down from Columbia University. Rosa Martinez had brought her entire extended family, 3 generations of women who understood what courage looked like. Patricia Vasquez live-streamed the ceremony on Facebook for the immigrant community networks that had rallied around our cause. As I walked down the aisle, I saw Charles Morrison's conspicuous absence, an empty chair among the family section that spoke louder than any protest he could have made. His refusal to attend his own son's wedding became part of the story, evidence of a man so consumed with maintaining power that he'd sacrifice his relationship with his only child. The minister, Reverend Jackson from Charleston's historic Emmanuel AME Church, had insisted on performing the ceremony after learning about our labor rights advocacy. His presence added moral weight to what society pages might otherwise dismiss as a publicity stunt. Marriage is about more than love between 2 people, Reverend Jackson said, his voice carrying across the garden. It's about justice, protection, and standing together against those who would do harm to the vulnerable. When Robert and I exchanged vows, we spoke words we'd written together, promises that went beyond personal commitment to encompass social responsibility. I promised to use whatever privilege I possess to protect those who cannot protect themselves, Robert said, his voice steady and certain. I promised to never again accept injustice in silence, I replied, thinking of every woman watching who'd found her own voice. Through witnessing mine, the reception transformed the Morrison Mansion's grand ballroom into something Charles had never intended, a celebration of workers' dignity in a house, built on their exploitation. Jennifer Walsh moved through the crowd like a general reviewing troops before battle, confirming final details for Monday mornings. Coordinated legal assault, Senator. Williams used her brief speech to announce federal labor investigations into hospitality industry practices across the Southeast. When patterns of exploitation become clear, she said, government has a responsibility to act. The applause was thunderous. The most powerful moment came when Carmen Rodriguez approached the microphone during the open floor portion of the reception. Her voice shook as she spoke, but her words were crystal clear. 2 years ago, I thought I was alone. I thought Charles Morrison's cruelty was something I had to accept because I needed the job, because I was afraid, because I didn't think anyone would believe me. She paused, looking directly at the news cameras. Today, I know I was never alone. There are dozens of us, maybe hundreds, and tomorrow we speak with one voice. The crowd rose in spontaneous standing ovation, and I saw tears in the eyes of journalists who'd covered countless Charleston society weddings, but never witnessed one that carried such emotional and political weight. Local news crews captured everything, but the real power was in social media. Maria spoke, and Morrison workers began trending across Facebook and Twitter, with hundreds of women sharing their own stories of workplace exploitation and finding courage in our collective voice. As the evening wound down, Robert and I stood on the mansion's front steps, watching news vans prepare their Sunday night broadcasts. Every major station would lead with our wedding story, priming Monday morning's audience for the legal bombshell about to drop. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Robert asked, his arm around my waist as photographers captured what would become the defining image of our campaign, the privileged heir and the immigrant worker, standing together against the empire built on exploitation. "I've been ready for 2 years," I said, watching Charles Morrison's bedroom light flicker off in the mansion's upper floor. He was alone in the house where dozens of staff once lived in fear of his moods, isolated by his own cruelty from the son who'd chosen justice over inheritance. Tomorrow morning would bring 7 simultaneous lawsuits, federal investigations, and national media attention focused on systematic labor abuse in America's hospitality industry. But tonight, surrounded by allies who'd become family and advocates who'd become friends, I felt something I hadn't experienced since arriving in Charleston 3 years ago: safety. The wedding had been beautiful, but it was just the beginning. Monday would bring the reckoning Charles Morrison had spent decades believing would never come. Justice delayed was not. Justice denied. It was justice perfectly timed for maximum impact. The celebration continued past midnight, but I wasn't celebrating the end of anything. I was celebrating the beginning of accountability, the dawn of consequences, and the sunrise of systematic change. Tomorrow, Charles Morrison would discover that some voices, once raised, could never again be silenced. Monday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, 7 courthouse clerks in 4 different states simultaneously received identical filing packets. Charleston, Columbia, Savannah, Atlanta. The coordinated legal assault on Charles Morrison's empire began with the precision of a military operation. I stood beside Jennifer Walsh at the federal courthouse in downtown Charleston, watching reporters gather as she prepared for the press conference that would change everything. The marble steps where we assembled had witnessed countless legal proceedings, but never one that would expose systematic labor trafficking on this scale. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jennifer began, her voice carrying across the crowd of journalists, activists, and federal investigators who'd assembled overnight. "Today, we file suit against Charles Morrison and Morrison Hotels for violations of federal labor law, systematic wage theft, sexual harassment, and creating hostile work environments that targeted vulnerable immigrant workers." The evidence display behind her looked like a prosecutor's dream. Enlarged photographs of forged timesheets, audio recordings of discriminatory conversations, financial documents showing millions in stolen wages, and testimony from 12 victims across 4 states. Carmen Rodriguez stepped to the microphone first, her voice steady despite the cameras focused on her face. "For 3 years, I cleaned Charles Morrison's hotels while he stole from my paycheck every week. He told me I should be grateful for the opportunity to work in America. Today, I'm grateful for the opportunity to seek justice in America." Rosa Martinez followed, holding the uniform Charles had never bothered to retrieve after firing her. "He fired me for refusing his advances in the wine cellar of his Charleston hotel. He said no one would believe a woman like me over a man like him. Today, we'll see if he was right." Patricia Vasquez presented her cell phone documentation, dozens of photos showing unsafe working conditions, understaffed kitchens, and workers forced to clean with broken equipment. "I documented everything because I knew someday someone would listen. That day is today." The legal filings painted a devastating picture of systematic criminal enterprise disguised as legitimate hospitality business. Charles Morrison hadn't just exploited individual workers, he'd created an institutional framework designed to extract maximum profit from vulnerable populations who couldn't fight back. Federal charges included wire fraud for falsified payroll records, money laundering for moving stolen wages through multiple bank accounts, and conspiracy to violate immigration law by threatening workers with deportation to maintain silence about labor violations. By noon, Charleston's federal courthouse was surrounded by news vans from Atlanta, Columbia, Raleigh, and Jacksonville. The story had gone regional, then national. as labor advocates across the country recognized the precedent-setting nature of our coordinated legal strategy. Charles Morrison's response was swift and predictable. Harrison and Associates filed emergency motions seeking to dismiss all charges, claiming the lawsuits were coordinated harassment designed to damage Morrison Hotel's business reputation through false accusations by disgruntled former employees. But Charles had made a crucial miscalculation. Our evidence wasn't testimonial, it was documentary. Audio recordings couldn't be dismissed as unreliable memory. Photographic evidence couldn't be explained away as misunderstanding. Financial records showing systematic wage theft spoke for themselves. The Department of Labor announced they were opening formal investigations into Morrison Hotel's employment practices at all 17 properties. The IRS indicated they would review payroll tax filings for potential violations. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, despite Charles's previous threats to call them on us, began investigating his use of deportation threats to silence workers. By afternoon, Morrison Hotel's stock price had dropped 40%. 3 major convention groups canceled bookings pending resolution of the labor investigations. Charleston's Tourism Board issued a statement distancing themselves from businesses that exploited workers. The media narrative had shifted completely from Sunday's fairy tale wedding coverage to Monday's systematic labor abuse exposed. Every news outlet in the Southeast led with our story, and national networks picked up the feed for evening broadcasts. Senator Williams held her own press conference, announcing federal legislation that would strengthen penalties for businesses that exploited immigrant workers. The Morrison case demonstrates that current laws are insufficient to protect vulnerable workers from systematic abuse, she declared. But the most satisfying moment came at 6:00 p.m., when local news cameras captured Charles Morrison leaving his downtown office flanked by lawyers, his face ashen as reporters shouted questions about wage theft and sexual harassment allegations. "Mr. Morrison, do you have any response to the accusations?" One journalist called out, Charles Morrison, the man who'd humiliated me in front of dinner guests, who'd threatened countless women with deportation, who'd built his fortune on silence and fear, had no comment. His empire of exploitation was crumbling, and for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. That evening, Robert and I sat in our Charleston apartment. We decided not to honeymoon until justice was served, watching national news coverage of our case. CNN featured a segment on labor trafficking in hospitality industries. MSNBC interviewed immigration lawyers about systematic abuse patterns. Fox News, surprisingly, ran a sympathetic piece about workers finding their voices against powerful employers. "How does it feel?" Robert asked as we watched Charles Morrison's mugshot appear on screen. He'd been arrested that afternoon on federal conspiracy charges. "Like the beginning," I said. "This case will inspire other workers to document abuse, other lawyers to coordinate resistance, other victims to break their silence." The legal avalanche had begun, but the real victory would be measured in changed lives, protected workers, and systematic reforms that would outlast any individual lawsuit. Charles Morrison's empire was falling, but something more important was rising in its place: accountability. 6 months after the legal avalanche began, Charles Morrison sat in a federal courtroom in Charleston, watching his empire receive its death sentence. Judge Patricia Hamilton, a no-nonsense jurist known for her expertise in labor law, read the final judgment with the measured precision of someone who understood the historical significance of the moment. The court finds Morrison Hotels guilty of systematic labor violations, wage theft, sexual harassment, and conspiracy to violate federal immigration law, Judge Hamilton announced. The financial penalties total $47 million in damages and fines. Additionally, the defendant will serve 18 months in federal prison. I sat in the gallery's front row, surrounded by the women whose courage had made this moment possible. Carmen Rodriguez squeezed my hand as Charles Morrison's face crumpled. The man who'd terrorized dozens of workers was finally experiencing fear himself. The financial destruction had been swift and total. Morrison Hotel's stock became worthless when major investors fled following the federal investigations. Marriott and Hilton canceled franchise agreements. Convention centers across the Southeast terminated contracts. The company that had once controlled 17 luxury properties was forced into bankruptcy liquidation. Charles's personal fortune evaporated alongside his business empire. The Charleston mansion was seized to satisfy judgment debts. His yacht, his art collection, his shares in Charleston's exclusive country club, everything was auctioned to compensate his victims. The man who'd once boasted about his net worth, exceeding $100 million, was left with barely enough money for legal fees, but the legal victory was only part of Charles Morrison's complete downfall. Charleston's social elite, who'd once competed for invitations to Morrison parties, now refused to acknowledge his existence. The country club expelled him. The charitable boards where he'd held prominent positions asked for his resignation. The social circles that had amplified his power abandoned him completely. Justice in this case extends beyond financial compensation, Judge Hamilton continued. Morrison Hotels will operate under federal oversight for 5 years. All employees will receive mandatory training on labor rights. An independent ombudsman will investigate any future complaints. These measures ensure that this pattern of abuse cannot be repeated. Rosa Martinez had used her settlement money to start a nonprofit organization supporting immigrant workers facing workplace exploitation. Her Charleston office, funded by our lawsuit victory, had already helped 43 women file labor complaints against abusive employers. Patricia Vasquez returned to school, using her settlement to complete a paralegal certification program. She now worked with Jennifer Walsh's firm, helping other victims document workplace violations using the techniques she'd learned during her years under Charles Morrison's exploitation. Carmen Rodriguez purchased a small house in North Charleston and brought her mother from Guatemala to live with her. Her daughter graduated from Columbia University with honors, having written her senior thesis on labor organizing in immigrant communities. The ripple effects extended far beyond our individual cases. The Morrison precedent was cited in labor courts across the country as proof that systematic workplace abuse could be successfully prosecuted through coordinated victim testimony and careful documentation. Congress passed the Morrison Act, strengthening penalties for businesses that exploited immigrant workers and providing federal protection for workplace whistleblowers. Senator Williams credited our case with providing the political momentum necessary to overcome corporate lobbying resistance. Charles Morrison's attempt to appeal his conviction failed spectacularly. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals not only upheld the judgment, but added additional penalties for frivolous litigation designed to intimidate his victims. His lawyers, facing potential sanctions, withdrew from the case. The day Charles Morrison reported to federal prison in Columbia, South Carolina, I stood outside the facility with Robert and the other women whose testimony had brought him to justice. We weren't there to gloat. We were there to witness accountability. Charles Morrison, who'd spent decades believing his wealth and social position made him untouchable, walked into federal custody wearing an orange jumpsuit like any other convicted criminal. The man who'd humiliated workers in front of his dinner guests was now subject to the same indignities he'd once inflicted on others. "How do you feel?" a reporter asked as we watched Charles disappear behind prison walls. "Satisfied," I replied. "Not because he's suffering, but because justice was served." Other women will see this outcome and know that powerful men aren't beyond accountability. Charleston's newspaper ran a retrospective series on the Morrison case, examining how systematic labor abuse had operated in plain sight while community leaders looked away. The series won a Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism and sparked similar investigations in cities across the South. Robert used his inheritance, what little remained after victim compensation, to establish the Morrison Foundation for Workers' Rights, headquartered in Charleston. The foundation provided legal aid, documentation training, and advocacy support for vulnerable workers facing exploitation. The mansion where I'd once been humiliated became headquarters for South Carolina's largest immigrant rights organization. The dining room where Charles had performed his cruelty for wealthy guests now hosted Know Your Rights workshops for housekeepers, kitchen staff, and maintenance workers. As I walked through downtown Charleston 6 months after Charles Morrison's conviction, past the hotels that now operated under federal oversight and the courthouse where justice had finally been served, I reflected on the distance between the terrified woman who'd started documenting abuse and the advocate I'd become. Charles Morrison's empire had fallen completely, but something more important had risen in its place: a network of empowered workers who knew their rights, documented violations, and refused to accept exploitation in silence. The tyrant of Charleston was gone. Justice had taken his place. 2 years after Charles Morrison's imprisonment, I stood in the renovated ballroom of the former Morrison Mansion, now headquarters of the Charleston Workers' Rights Center, watching 50 immigrant women receive certificates in workplace advocacy training. The room where Charles had once entertained Charleston's elite while humiliating his staff had been transformed into a space of empowerment and education. Today, you graduate not just as advocates for yourselves, but as protectors of others who face the same exploitation you've experienced, I said, addressing the women in both English and Spanish. You have the knowledge, the legal resources, and the network to ensure that what happened to us never happens to another generation of workers. The Morrison Foundation had grown beyond anything Robert and I had imagined when we'd started it with the remnants of his inheritance. Federal grants, private donations, and corporate partnerships had funded worker advocacy centers in 12 cities across the Southeast. Each center offered legal aid, documentation training, and direct support for workers facing exploitation. Rosa Martinez, now our regional director for Georgia and South Carolina, had helped establish similar programs in Atlanta, Savannah, and Columbia. Her nonprofit had successfully prosecuted 47 cases of workplace abuse, recovering over $3 million in stolen wages and securing protection for hundreds of vulnerable workers. Carmen Rodriguez had become our most effective trainer, teaching other women how to document workplace violations using the techniques that had brought down Charles Morrison. Her daughter, now a labor lawyer fresh from law school, had joined Jennifer Walsh's firm and specialized in immigrant workers' rights cases. Patricia Vasquez managed our technology programs, developing smartphone apps that allowed workers to securely document wage theft, safety violations, and harassment while protecting their identities until they were ready to seek legal action. The Morrison Protocol had been downloaded by over 10,000 workers nationwide. The transformation of Charleston itself had been remarkable. The city that had once tolerated Charles Morrison's systematic abuse now boasted the strongest worker protection laws in South Carolina. Mayor Chen, elected on a platform of labor rights and immigrant protections, had made Charleston a sanctuary city for workers reporting workplace violations. The hospitality industry throughout the region had undergone fundamental changes. The Morrison Act required federal oversight of any hotel or restaurant with more than 50 employees. Worker advocacy groups had seats on industry boards. Anonymous reporting systems protected whistleblowers from retaliation. Robert had found his calling as a policy advocate, working with legislators across the country to strengthen labor protections. His testimony before Congress about growing up in a household built on worker exploitation had been instrumental in passing federal legislation that expanded worker rights and increased penalties for systematic abuse. The Morrison case proved that documentation, coordination, and courage could bring down even the most powerful abusers. Robert told the Senate Labor Committee during hearings on the Worker Protection Enhancement Act, "We need systems that support workers who find the strength to speak truth to power." Charles Morrison's release from federal prison had been met with silence rather than fanfare. The man who'd once commanded newspaper headlines and social attention emerged from incarceration to find himself completely irrelevant. No job prospects, no social connections, no wealth to rebuild his empire. He'd rented a small apartment in North Charleston, far from the historic district where he'd once reigned as an unquestioned authority. Occasional sightings reported him working part-time at a convenience store, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on the workers whose wages he'd once stolen. But our focus had shifted from Charles Morrison's punishment to preventing future Charles Morrisons from exploiting vulnerable workers. The real victory wasn't his downfall, it was the systematic changes that made such exploitation harder to conceal and easier to prosecute. The international attention our case had received led to worker advocacy, exchanges with organizations in Guatemala, Mexico, and Honduras. Women who'd been trafficked or exploited in the United States shared their successful organizing strategies with workers in their home countries, creating a transnational network of resistance. Standing in that transformed ballroom, watching women receive certificates that represented their transition from victims to advocates, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. The terrified housemaid who'd started recording Charles Morrison's cruelty could never have imagined the movement that would grow from her determination to document injustice. "Maria," called out, "Sofia Hernandez, one of our newest trainees, what advice do you have for women who are afraid to speak up?" "Start by documenting everything," I replied, the same advice Jennifer Walsh had given me years ago. "Record dates, times, witnesses, and violations. Build your case carefully and connect with advocates who can help you find your voice safely. Remember that your courage doesn't just protect you, it protects every woman who comes after you." The applause that followed wasn't just for my words, but for the transformation those words represented. Fear had been replaced by knowledge, isolation by community, exploitation by empowerment. As the ceremony concluded and the women filed out carrying their certificates and resource packets, I walked to the mansion's front windows overlooking Charleston Harbor. The same view Charles Morrison had enjoyed while planning new ways to exploit workers now framed a city where worker advocacy thrived and systematic abuse faced swift, coordinated resistance. The Morrison name would forever be associated with this transformation, not because of the empire Charles had built on exploitation, but because of the justice movement that had risen from its ashes. Legacy wasn't about the power you accumulated, it was about the change you created. The Morrison legacy was no longer about one cruel man's reign of terror. It was about the moment when victims became advocates, when documentation became justice, and when courage became contagious enough to change an entire system. That was a legacy worth building. This completes the 10-chapter narrative following your approved structure. Each chapter maintains about 5,000 characters while building the complete story of Maria's strategic transformation from victim to advocate, ultimately creating systematic change that extends far beyond individual justice.